We often hear about vampires in popular legends, such as Dracula or even Vlad the Impaler. They are creatures that are often depicted with fangs and prey upon humans with the sole purpose of drinking their blood. While they are common amongst folklore and fiction stories, they have since been vomited over the cinema scene, sadly, but once upon a time, vampires were once considered to be a very real threat in history. It leads me to talk about the case of Mercy Brown, a woman accused of being a vampire long after she was put 6 feet under. Some later tales by the townsfolk of Exeter, Rhode Island, described Mercy Brown as lurking in the night, stalking through graveyards, all of which they believed was her process of sinking her teeth into the neck of another. It was the year 1892, and tuberculosis was perhaps the leading cause of death in the United States. The symptoms included fatigue, night sweats, and the coughing of phlegm or even foamy blood. There was no reliable treatment for tuberculosis at the time, nor was there much in the way of medical research. To be frank, no one, not even doctors, had much of a clue as to what tuberculosis was or how to go about curing it. As a highly contagious disease, it wasn't uncommon for one person of a household to spread it to others. It is exactly what happened to the Brown family in Exeter, Rhode Island, when a farmer named George Brown lost his wife, Mary Eliza, to the disease in 1884. 2 years later, Mary Olive Brown, George's oldest daughter, suffered the same fate before his oldest son Edwin began to show signs of the affliction. A family was being wiped out by this horrible disease, and unfortunately, the only thing that anyone could do was watch as it all unfolded. It wouldn't be long before Mercy Brown, the final daughter of George Brown, lost her battle with tuberculosis and was laid to rest. Edwin, the last remaining child, was soon on his last legs. He had nearly coughed up his lungs and was in such physical anguish that he may very well have looked like death warmed up. His father George, though, was desperate to save his life, having lost the rest of his family to tuberculosis. In fact, he was so desperate, he was even willing to turn to an old, sinister superstition. The superstition detailed that a deceased relative may have been the cause of tuberculosis, in that in death, they were now feeding on the life force of those who still remained. The only way to stop this from happening, according to the superstition, was to dig up the bodies of the relatives, remove the heart, and then burn the bodies. Even this, though, would take a lot of convincing, because George Brown didn't want to disturb the graves of his wife and daughters. But one look at Edwin, and George knew that if there was even a remote chance of saving his boy, he would do whatever it took. As it turns out, George Brown wouldn't be the one making any vile sacrifices or committing any taboos. No, that task was unfortunately reserved for Edwin, which we'll talk about in a moment. On the morning of March 17th, 1892, Mary Eliza, Mary Olive, and Mercy Brown were all exhumed from their graves and closely examined. Mary Eliza and Mary Olive had shown advanced stages of decay, which was as to be expected. But the 9-week-old corpse of Mercy Brown was said to have looked surprisingly normal, with no signs of decay at all. To make this case even more compelling, it's understood that blood was found in Mercy's heart and liver. Her hair had grown out, her nails were longer, and it's said that she was not in the same position she was in when she was lowered into the ground. When this was announced, the locals agreed that this had to have been a case of vampirism, in that Mercy Brown was feeding on her family from beyond the grave, literally sucking their life force away. It's here that some supposed eyewitness accounts begin to crop up, where it's claimed that Mercy Brown was seen after her death, prowling in the night, usually wandering the graveyard in search of victims. The doctor of the town noted that the state of Mercy Brown after being dead and underground wasn't exactly unusual, given that her body hadn't been buried immediately, and instead was stored above ground until the ice had thawed, allowing for a grave to even be dug. Therefore, it's only natural she would appear to be in far better condition than that of her mother and sister. Either way, the townsfolk agreed that Mercy Brown was compromised, and so took her heart and liver and ritualistically burned them. The ashes were collected, mixed with water, and then presented to Edwin, who would be forced to consume the concoction. Supposedly, this was a remedy for tuberculosis, or at least a way in which to sever the ties that the vampire Mercy Brown had on her brother. As you might imagine, the concoction did nothing but make Edwin puke, and would see to him dying just 2 months later. An article from the Boston Daily Globe in 1896 details how fears about vampirism was indeed a real thing, and that Rhode Island in particular were becoming so aware of the danger that digging up graves and burning the deceased was not uncommon. Mercy Brown's appearance and the maintaining of her blood led locals to believe that she had walked the earth once more, visiting victims and drinking their blood, hence why her liver was full of it. To these locals, Mercy Brown was the culprit for her family's death, and therefore they believed that they were entirely justified in burning her body parts if it meant keeping the rest of themselves safe. Perhaps it had all just gotten out of hand, and the only thing paranormal here was how the idea of drinking the ashes of your dead relatives was even proposed. Whether or not vampires are real or not is up for you to decide, but at least in the case of Mercy Brown, she doesn't appear to have ever physically harmed anyone by means of vampirism. However, I'm sure if you asked the townsfolk of Exeter, Rhode Island in the late 1800s, they'd certainly have a few tales for you. As always guys, if you've enjoyed today's video, then don't forget to give the video a thumbs up and hit the subscribe button. Until the next time guys.